want to also extend my appreciation to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Nokuthula Kunene, for taking the baton forward. This lecture is an expression of a commitment by the Vice-Chancellor to ensure that we build on the foundation that has been set, where she was also part of the builders. And Professor Makgoba, this initiation of the Vice-Chancellor's public lecture series was part of the institution's attempt to deepen and to sustain and promote what we call the intellectual project of the university. The academic project is sustained through everyday lectures, but this one is to take the ideas beyond the classroom, but to make sure that these are fused as a way of sophisticating people's stay within the university. Without waste of time, I would like to call the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Zululand, Professor Nokuthula Kunene, to give us the opening address.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Prof. Siepe. The University of Zululand Chairperson of Council, Professor Mabunda, and all members of University Council who are possibly online, the executive management of the University of Zululand, and extended management of the University of Zululand, deans, directors, deputy deans, staff, and students of the University of Zululand. And of course, Professor Siepe, the chairperson of this session, Professor Lala, the respondent, and most importantly, our guest speaker for today's webinar, Professor Malegapuru Makgoba, and also your spouse who is here with us, Advocate Nakiti Elizabeth Rubane. I greet you all and thank you for joining this webinar. Sanibonani. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Vice-Chancellor's webinar series for 2026 on a topic that is very close to my heart. Just over 10 years ago, students in South African universities erupted and launched a campaign for free and decolonized education under the banner #Fees Must Fall and #Rhodes Must Fall. The students brought into sharp focus the question of the essence of university education. And by doing so, the very idea of a university. The students' movement reignited debates that link the notion of a modern university in Africa with the European colonial project, whose ambition was the conquest of African society. This was part of what the colonizers saw as a civilizing mission, as mentioned by Mamdani, 2019, to morally, culturally, and materially uplift supposedly backward societies. This understanding triggered a wave of decolonization hype in African by naturalist leaders and intellectuals. The debate continues to this day. Decolonial scholars, as mentioned by Ndlovu Kacheni, and indeed us at the University of Zululand continue to grapple with the theory and practice of changing the modern university from being a university in Africa, which is a transplant from Europe and America into Africa, to an university which is an African university that is decolonized. From these deliberations, a number of frameworks or grammars of change have emerged. Their purpose is to chart a path aimed at creating what can be defined as an African university. Inevitably, the different frameworks generate different meanings of what an African university looks like. Against this backdrop, I'd like to present a conceptual overview of three influential approaches to change that have gained prominence in recent decades. I will then offer a glimpse into some of the complexities that may be concealed within the quest of authenticity. Finally, I will conclude by advancing the proposition that the creation of an authentically African university is not a fixed destination, but a continuous process of learning and becoming. I now turn to the frameworks or grammars of change that have shaped and continue to shape efforts to reimagine the university in Africa. So if I start with the framework for changing the idea of university. For me, outlining and engaging with the grammars of change is an invitation to plot the prospects for achieving the intended outcomes. However, within the scope of my welcome, it will be presumptuous to claim that I can do justice to the many compelling arguments that have been generated towards our understanding of what could inform the creation of an African university. I will therefore pick on some of the salient features of each of the three somewhat overlapping grammars of change: Africanization, Afrocentricity, and decoloniality. Africanization, one of the luminaries for this approach, is among us here today, and I'm proud to say he is our guest speaker today, who of course will be formally introduced later. For now, I can just say that we are greatly honored and feel rejuvenated to have you here, Prof. Makgoba. At the risk of oversimplifying deeper conceptualizations and insight, allow me to share my understanding of some key focus areas of this perspective. For me, Africanization, the university, includes making visible and mainstreaming into the university curriculum African identity, culture, and values. This may be done through, for example, integrating indigenous knowledge systems into university knowledge production and dissemination. At the University of Zululand, some research is already underway in furtherance of this thrust. Seen from this angle, I would say, as Africans, we are urged to enact intellectual agency and resist epistemic dependency. This proposition resonates well with the call from students' movement for decolonizing the university. It also lays accessible prospect for the change envisaged in the theme of today. When I talk about Afrocentricity, as put by Molefi Asante It can be argued that this framework shares a foundational drive with African indigenization movements in seeking to reclaim and validate local epistemologies against colonial imposition. According to Afrocentric thinking, the creation of an African university would, among other things, include development of an Afrocentric curriculum which preserves the best of African ancestral traditions while opening the door for the ideas for the rest of the world. This is seen as providing a base of good prospects for the construction of a real African Renaissance. And then when I talk about decoloniality, this grammar of change, which others simply call decolonization, must not be understood as a singular theoretical school of thought. Decolonial scholars have shown that decoloniality is a family of diverse positions that share the view that coloniality is a fundamental problem in a modern age. Given this understanding, decoloniality is one of the powerful theories to deploy for turning our university into an African university. Saying this, however, calls for a critical level of clarity on how we understand and practice decoloniality. We learn from Maldonado Torres, who in 2015, some of important features to think about when he writes, decoloniality is never pure nor perfect, and it does not count with full picture of what a decolonized institution, society, or world can be. Decoloniality is rather an attitude that keeps subjects and collectives open to growth and corrections as well as unfinished projects. Student movements are calling for the end of this hypocrisy. They want the university to become an engine of decoloniality, facilitating creative works, ideas, and projects that advance the unfinished project of decoloniality. Ladies and gentlemen, I think these are profound words from which I would like to highlight three broad takeaways. As we decolonize, we have an imaginary of a university of the future. We don't know what it looks like. This means that decolonization is an innovative fix as you go process. We also see that to sustain the process, we need to develop an attitude of mental lens for continuous learning with which we view, interpret, and act on the world. Lastly, all this needs the source of creativity that does not shy away or turn a blind eye to the colonialities that continue to shape the content and form of a modern university in Africa. In wrapping up these three broad narratives or grammars for change, I would like to highlight in summary form what Ndlovu Kacheni in 2015 suggests about what are some of the key things we need to do to create an African university. One, to return to base. This is what he calls locus of enunciation, or thinking from where we are, that is in Africa. It also includes the use of language and the language that people speak to produce, disseminate, and use knowledge to solve the challenges we and humanities in general face, thus making Africa visible. In short, to create an African university, we must shift the geographical location of thinkers and global knowledge producers. Secondly, rethinking or thinking itself. In the context of decolonization, to rethink thinking refers to casting light onto subjugated peoples, knowledge, and ways of living in ways that recreate lives of those whom coloniality seeks to erase. Put differently, rethinking thinking can be seen as an alternative way of figuring out how to transform society and its institutions, such as a university. It is a way of confronting and dismantling the colonial matrix of power that has gripped every effect of our lives. In modern radical terms, it refers to systemic disobedience, which means refusal to subject ourselves to Western epistemologies as the only source of truth. At the same time, it also acknowledges that all human beings have valid, legitimate, and functioning knowledge systems which must find their way into university curriculum. Thirdly, he says we need to learn to unlearn in order to relearn. In a colonized curriculum, we have, for example, learned that indigenous knowledge systems are traditional and not useful for development. For this reason, it must therefore be excluded or marginalized from the curriculum. However, to create a distinctively African university, we should unlearn this and relearn from the indigenous epistemologies what can help us to solve societal challenges. The foregoing ideas, Program Director, excite me because they signal what I see as a strong prospect for creating a decolonized African university. The narratives constitute a rich reservoir of intellectual insights from which we can use to craft a framework of strategies and actions to wave the struggle that should produce not just an African university, but one that is authentically African. Yes, as I place emphasis on the notion of authenticity, I am compelled to moderate my opinion, for the opportunities and challenges associated with transformation become evident once the concept is critically deployed. Let me, in a nutshell, attempt to illuminate what I have in mind and determining the authenticity of change, challenges, and opportunities. From what I have said above, it should be clear that there is agreement on the need of change. What remains contentious, however, is the quality of change in terms of its authenticity. Although it can be said that authenticity is implied in all the three grammars of change that I spoke about, decolonial scholarships warns that the term is elusive and subject to varied interpretation. I'd like to just illustrate this contention by citing two that stand out for me. The potential trap of essentialism. In the quest for authenticity, Mullard 2025 has warned against falling into the trap of essentialism, meaning that we relate this thinking to the creation of an authentically African university. We should seek to clarify what it means. By authentically African, are we are talking, are we talking of a romanticized pre-colonial past culture and cosmologies, suggesting that change will be informed by portraying the colonial past as the idyllic state of perfect harmony, instead of viewing these societies as complex and dynamic, containing both constructive traditions and destructive elements. This type of freezing can be a challenge for progress. In other words, attempting to return to the idea of purified native subject may be an impossible illusion, which may work against the change we are trying to achieve. By casting disproportionate gaze on the past, we can inadvertently leave the Western-centric university system intact. On the other hand, by deploying the discourse of authenticity, we may be creating an opportunity to raise awareness of our past and thus allowing us as Africans to reclaim and learn or relearn from our heritage how to build an Afrocentric university education. In so doing, we can also unlearn some oppressive Western-centric traditions which are manifested in the modern university systems. Rejecting epistematic erasure, having been educated in Westernized university system, we have been taught that the only authentic, rational, or valid knowledge is that which is based on Western defined canons of rigor and skepticism as the sole arbiters of truth. Such a view tends to inflict epistematic erasure of indigenous knowledge systems. This challenge presents an opportunity to deploy the change narratives I talked about above, to reject the Eurocentric monopoly and validating local epistemologies, cosmologies, ways of being, and to assert and recenter Afrocentric perspective into university form and content. We can call authentically African. When doing this, however, we must guard against what might appear as simply revenge to remove and replace, instead of creating a new reality of an authentically African university. In light of the foregoing, creating an authentically African university speaks to the centering of Africa as a legitimate epistemic site from which to see and experience the world, the locus of enunciation. In conclusion, the case for creating an authentically African university has been in the making for decades. During all this time, to date, rich archives of theory-informed experimentations have been produced. Yet, and I say that with all the commitment to the noble vision, it is still difficult to point to a living example of what an authentically African university looks like. This also echoes the sentiments that Maldonado Torres expressed above. No doubt, this is a complex and existential struggle that requires persistent effort in learning, unlearning, and relearning. When seen from this angle, an authentically African university may not be a destination per se. Instead, we must speak of this imaginary as an evolving journey of becoming an authentically African university. That alone, I think, is a liberatory praxis, food for thought. With these words, I wish all of us a fruitful deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, for setting the scene. But I'll also go further, that what you've also presented is what we call a desiderata, the things that this university must seek when we talk about transforming this university. And also your articulation of the grammar of change, and your articulation of the fact that we would, as you put it, fix as we go on. But what is most important is that we must reclaim the agency and the intellectual sovereignty in that process. And you are quite correct that one of the people who is the author of one of the grammars of change is in our midst. And we were also fortunate to have also hosted Professor Mulifi Keta Asante, who is also considered to be the father of Afrocentricity. But today, we thought it would be important to bring somebody who will also be able to give concrete expression to what these grammars of change mean in a real situation. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you, but before he stands up, I do not want to undermine. We often say Professor Makgoba or people like him do not need any introduction, but they're doing so with risk failing to appreciate that in their presence, we are in the midst of greatness. First, what you'll discover, even a simple search, will show you one thing that Professor Makgoba is a prominent South African and global immunologist. He's also a physician, he's an academic leader, and like Professor Kunene said, he's also a champion of African-centered knowledge production. His background is in medicine, and among other things, achievements, is that he did his DPhil in Oxford, University of Oxford, in human immunogenetics. And one should also indicate that he was the first Nuffield Dominion Fellow at university. And he also pioneered research on lymphocyte adhesion molecules, T cells function. And as a result of his work, he was also invited by the former president of the United States to share his scholastic achievement and excellence. He has done and produced a lot of publications in advanced molecular immunology. So when I say you are in the midst of greatness, it is precisely because he's one of the outstanding scientists this country has produced. He also has a misfortune or fortune of having been the first black deputy vice-chancellor at the University of Witwatersrand, and also the president of the South African Medical Research Council. And lastly, in his stint in higher education, he was a vice-chancellor and principal of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he foresaw its successful merger and elevated its research profile, as you'll discover today, including initiatives in HIV and TB research. He is a passionate advocate for African Renaissance and decolonization of knowledge. He edited the seminal book, which you must get. Um, the director of libraries is here. A book called African Renaissance, which put together some of the best minds in the continent. And Professor Makgoba was behind the putting together of that book, which tries to reflect on the historical, cultural, and geographical context of this aim of producing African-centered knowledge. He has, of course, many honors, including the Order of Makgoba for pioneering higher education transformation, and also he is a he holds the National Research Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award and many other fellowships from prestigious institutions. My first encounter with Professor Makgoba, like many of you, was when he was announced to be the first black vice chancellor, deputy vice chancellor for the University of Witwatersrand. And at that time, he did what most people would not do when they get into a place. What he did was to disrupt the thinking. Professor Dladla, one of the things that was known in this country was always that the thinking was always between what you call historically white and historically black. But it was Professor Makgoba who, when he arrived, introduced the concept of an African. And in doing so, he angered both groups because for South African political discourse, it was clear that you are either left or right wing, you are either white or black. But what he did was to say we need to put the African in the center of our discourse. And as the late Eddie Webster put it, instead of being embraced at the University of Witwatersrand, he angered so many and ultimately led to what became what you call the Makgoba Affair. And that book, which he wrote, is very important for people to understand what the challenges of transforming the system is going to look like. I had also the privilege and honor of being asked by the former minister Kara Asmal with Professor Makgoba to pen a paper on the African identity of higher education, and out of which we produced a book. And Professor Makgoba was also part of a group of scholars that are put together to organize a conference at that time on the Black perspective on transformation, because we felt that the discourse was displacing or peripheralizing the contribution of African scholars. He has also the fortune or misfortune of having worked with almost every president of this country. And for that, he decided also to pen his last book, reflecting on the concept of leadership. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'll give you an inkling of who you have in your presence. So the notion of saying he needs no introduction would be a disservice to the man who has contributed so much to higher education and to the politics of leadership in this country, Professor Malegapuru.
Vice-Chancellor Kunene, the Chair of Council, Professor Dladla, distinguished colleagues, I hope there are members of the SRC in here that I should also acknowledge because they are often known as the most important people. And of course, I've got my wife here. Perhaps she's more distinguished than I am because she was in the group in 1976 that banned this university. So if you need some advice of how to bring change much quicker than through debates and through action, maybe you should talk to her. She's sitting here in front of us. Professor Siposiepe and I go a long way, and he has always been a good friend, never shy to critique anyone, but also you never try to get on the wrong side of Professor Siepe if you are wise enough to know how sharp his pen would be. Then it's the audience here, the distinguished guests and colleagues, some of you that I might have met in my career or in my life somewhere. I've been asked to talk on a very daunting subject of establishing an authentic African university and its prospects, challenges, and the opportunities that exist. It's not easy, but I will try my best to justify Sipo's introduction about me so that I can earn your respect. I've got three messages that I'll cover. The first one is really the creation of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. The second one would be to talk about the concept what I believe an African university should be, recognizing that there are many universities in Africa that are not African. I think we have to distinguish the two things. An African university is not like a university located in Africa, because most of these universities in Africa are actually outposts of our colonial past. They still champion the colony. They are still out there to civilize the natives and to bring them into a Western domain of thinking. And in fact, they do it so well and so proud that they are actually unconscious of what they are doing. They are oppressing Africans at the pinnacle of the education system, claiming to be universities, miseducating us, but claiming to educate us. But that's a much bigger debate, I think, to undertake. But let me start by doing a simple thing. There is a slide that has been projected there. For those that can see it, I can barely see it, but it's fine. It's a slide that I prepared in 2013, just a year before my retirement, because I've been retired since 2014. It's a summary of what happened at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. It has got two parts. There's the left and the right-hand part, and I'll just read a few things there. In 2013, when I left the University of KwaZulu-Natal, 67% of our students were African. 61% of those students were females in South Africa. Remember that the population average for female in South Africa is 52 or 51, somewhere like that. But 61% were female at the university. And in fact, they were the ones that got the most distinctions and cum laudes at the graduate, the females. I think we often don't realize that. And 84% of our graduates were often employed within 6 months of graduating at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. 30% of the academic leadership at the university were female, and 82% of the staff by the time I left were all research active, compared to about 37% when we started. So it was an institution that was dynamic, that was alive, and that was enjoying what universities should be. In 2013 and 2014, the University of KwaZulu-Natal was #1 in terms of research productivity in the country, above all the institutions. It was ranked within the 3% of the university's top world universities, which are about 21 or 22,000 in the world. And as I said, 82% of its staff were research active. And what was very interesting was that compared with the national average, 80, 82 or no, 79% of the junior staff were all working or had PhDs at the University of Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, compared to the national average of about 40 or so percent at the time. So it was a university that had arisen out of the merger and had decided to take a different trajectory to try and live to this reputation of being an African university. And I'll come to that in much greater detail. Now, there's something I want to read into the record because I don't want to be misquoted by either journalists or by academics. I'm going to read this paragraph because I think it's the most important paragraph, just like that slide. Most of you after this can sleep and I will talk until I finish, but at least you'll have got the message. The raison d'etre for the transformation of higher education in South Africa was about the creation, the interpretation, and incorporation of African knowledge and perspective into the global knowledge system. It was about the identity of the African knowledge system into the global knowledge system, because otherwise it has just been ignored or exploited. While demographics or equity as it's commonly known mattered and is of necessity and continue to be the essential and the obvious manifestation of such transformation, would be integral to this rationale. Of course, during the time after 1994, when we acquired our so-called freedom, some scholars, especially in the so-called liberal universities, Wits, Rhodes, UCT, and Natal at the time, in order to avoid transformation, argued very strongly that quality knowledge cannot coexist with equity. It was a big argument that took place in the country. They couldn't coexist, they were inimical to each other. So if you needed to transform the university to bring black people or African people into the standard would go low and they would simply fail. But if you wanted to maintain your quality, you had to leave the so-called liberal institutions alone so that they can carry on with the quality that they had without questioning whose quality was that they were talking about and whose knowledge was it that they were teaching. And by common sense, at the time, most of those universities were out here like missionaries to civilize Africans, make them better or pseudo-wise in their image. That was really their whole mission that they were carrying out. So the creation of the University of Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, as I've spelled out on that slide, debunked this myth that you can have equity and still change the university so that it reflects its population and it reflects the input of those people that are in that university at the highest level. Let's not kid ourselves. We know that Africans through the ages have had knowledge. Otherwise, they would not have survived. They've had observations. They've had experiences. They've had scientific systems of their own throughout the ages. Africans had agriculture. They had health system, whether you called it witchcraft or traditional or whatever it is. it was their health system. They managed to cure a few people or many people. They managed to look after each other and care for each other. They had astronomical knowledge. They had technology knowledge. That's why you had the kingdoms of Mapungube, where they were trading on gold already, way back in centuries. And this is often referred to as indigenous knowledge. Now, in 2012, when I was still Vice-Chancellor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I started a project that was called a signature project. And that signature project was to get indigenous knowledge to become part of the global knowledge system. That was in 2012. And in 2012, the Council of the University approved this project, which was quite difficult because of the contestations within South Africa and within the university system. Last year, which is now almost 12 years since I left the university, UNESCO recognized indigenous knowledge system as part of the global knowledge system. To be integral to the global knowledge system. And they recognized a hub that is located at UKZN that has managed to link 36 institutions globally in order to champion indigenous knowledge systems. And that tells you that sometimes you may have an idea that sounds wild or unconventional, but if you believe in the authenticity and the quality of that idea, you fight for it. You don't stop. And it takes time sometimes for the world to listen and to internalize what one says. So we now have a knowledge system, an indigenous knowledge system that started at UKZN that is now going to be incorporated into the global knowledge system. So you are no longer variants or people that should be ignored. You can now contribute into this system as best as you can. At the same time, we established a globally recognized research center in Hlabisa called the African Research Health Center, funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in the US. And it is there to deal with demography in a rural area in Hlabisa. But it is actually the champion of TB and HIV. I think you read a lot about people like Slim Karim, Abdul Karim, so forth in this area. They are part of that system. And actually, he was integral himself to raise the funds of his precursor called Kerry. So that's another area that brings African knowledge system into the global system. Remember that the two major research foundations that fund medical research in the world is the Wellcome Trust and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in the United States. And both of them were attracted to UKZN to establish this globally research institute that we had to fight for against the University of the Witwatersrand and the University of Cape Town, but ultimately we won the bid. Recently, the University of KwaZulu-Natal has established a research chair about the first poet laureate of the country, Professor Mazizi Kunene. I think most of you coming from this area would know him, to recognize, I think, indigenous languages, literary scholarship that connects, I think, literature and demography and poetry into African scholarship at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So these are just three examples to give you as to what the University of KwaZulu-Natal has been about. So I've spoken about, gave an example of the sciences. I've given an example of the indigenous knowledge system. but I've also given you a specific one that relates to isiZulu language. And finally, I can tell you that when I was there, one of the battles I fought at the university was to establish isiZulu as a subject to be undertaken by every undergraduate student. We made it compulsory that you couldn't live in a province where about 85% of the people speak Zulu. They dream in Zulu, they sing in Zulu, they make poetry in Zulu, and they talk Zulu all the time. And you are a Mlungu here, you don't hear them, but you want to be their boss. Just didn't make sense. But you know, colonialism had its own dynamics, and we were saying we are now out of that colonial era. Let's create an era that is actually where the agenda is set by us. It's our country, it's our future, and it's the future of our own children. And we must determine that rather than continue to allow people to determine it. And the university, being the highest pinnacle of the education system, should reflect that. It shouldn't become discordant with society. That, you know, you live in Soweto, and as soon as you leave Soweto and you come through the gates of Wits, you must become a different person altogether. Dance quite in Soweto, and then when you arrive at Wits, you must be a ballroom dancer. It's just, you couldn't exist in such a schizophrenic life, but that's what the colonialism was doing to us, and we were accepted. So let's give you what I think are the characteristics of a university before I talk about an African university. Universities throughout the world, throughout, are fountains of knowledge and innovation in society. So creating or establishing an African university is precisely about this new knowledge creation, but significantly about opening a new paradigm or a world in contributing to global knowledge system. That's what we try to do at the University of Malegapuru. Knowledge in every society is carried through culture, it's carried through tradition, and it's carried through language. If you speak Zulu and you arrive in a place like Kunene where they don't speak Zulu, they'll be able to distinguish that either you speak a Fanagalo Bedi or vice versa. But because the language is the thing that distinguishes you from everybody. So in 2004, when UKZN was created through the merger of the University of Durban Westville and Natal University, UKZN focused on improving research productivity, precisely to continue to generate knowledge that is African-centered. It enrolled a lot of postgraduate students into master's programs and into PhD programs. And more important, it made one fundamental change that every university academic must have a PhD, because that's the simplest and minimum requirement, and that became compulsory. And it was a project that was monitored by the Vice-Chancellor. If you didn't register for a PhD, you were called to go and see the Vice-Chancellor and ask why. And the explanation was either you wanted to stay at the university and get your PhD, or you must go and teach at the high school. There was no ambiguity about it. And suddenly, almost every academic at the university realized that that was the rule, and they registered, gave them time, gave them funding so that they could get their PhD and look like their peers everywhere in the world. That when you are a university lecturer or a university professor, you have a PhD. You don't come through the back door and say, I was so and so's son, My dad was a vice-chancellor, then I can just become anything. We made it compulsory. So I think once people got that message very clear, and also established what I call future projects, and one of them is that I should about. The other one is about race and identity, because that's a big problem in South Africa and several others. So out of this, as we were creating the university, which is part of the norm of the university system anyway, this new university has remained competitive and consistently ranked within the top 2.5% of the universities globally. In 2014 and 2015, it was ranked number 45 and number 47 within the BRICS countries and economies. In 2013 and 2014, it was ranked number 1 in South Africa in terms of the Department of High Research Productivity Units. The second feature of this creation, it's this: knowledge and scholarship have signatures. So knowledge belongs to someone. You know that Einstein discovered, the E equals mc squared. Say Isaac Newton discovered the laws of motions. They just didn't sprint from nowhere. So knowledge belongs to someone. And as Edward Said put it, no modern intellectual writes in Esperanto or Esperanto. That is a language designed either to belong to the whole world. You don't do things that way. You belong somewhere. You have an identity. Your knowledge is contextual. It comes from someone. Every individual is born into a language, and for the most part, spends the rest of his or her life in that language. We sing in Zulu, dance in Zulu. We see Amabutu everywhere. They are not doing anything that is you will see if you go to Europe. They're doing something that you will see when you come to KZN. You won't see it even in many parts of South Africa. So for the most part of a person's life, they live in this principal medium of the language that they were born into. So in this province, for example, most people live in isiZulu, in their actual livelihoods, and that's their intellectual activity of their brains. And all of you know words such as Victorian architecture, Edwardian style, German engineering, Japanese technology, Western knowledge are common speak in everyday language. So it just emphasizes that there's no knowledge that has got no signature of where it belongs or where it originated. Now, Professor Z.K. Matthews, who was a professor, one of the first graduates in this country around 1924, he got his first degree, argued, I think, through many of his scholarly publications that a system of education for the African must rely on Africanization. That was in the early 30s when he brought this word. That it is the system must be based on African conceptual and cognitive ideological issues, such as history and culture. People's cultures and history are essential for their education and for the continuation of their culture. He believed at the time that Western and Eastern system of education were not sufficiently constructed in terms of their curriculum to meet, I quote, the needs of the African people. And he used this word, gone are the days when the African child were satisfied to learn about all the capitals of the world, the capes, the peninsula of Europe and America, while they remained ignorant of the river that flew through their villages and the chiefs and the kings that ruled them. They didn't know them. Even today, most South African children are not taught history that is relevant to their lives. I remember when I was in the US, they asked Chinese students, who is the president of the US? It was in 1988 or so. And they answered Michael Jackson. So you can imagine, this is in China. So it just tells you what history we teach. Even I'm sure even Michael Jackson would would laugh in his own grave that he was recognized in China as the president of the US. So there is something about, as I say, about Africanization that comes a long way. Knowledge of history must now have an equal place with ancient or modern European and American history. The African child must be taught to be proud about his own background, as well as the rich traditions of the world. So you are not parochial about this knowledge. It doesn't mean that because I grew up Skunot and Kunene, all I must know is about Skunot and Kunene. I must understand that there's a world out there, and that world also lives to influence what I do. But I'm anchored somewhere else. The traditions that I champion are those from where I come from. And the knowledge that I carry obviously starts from there. All this is what is described as the Africanization of the curriculum in the African school, which must not be understood to imply any lowering of the standards of education. This is what Professor Matthews said, as I say, in the early 30s. The third feature I want to bring is universities have an identity. In 1956, those of you who read history, you have heard of somebody called Kwame Nkrumah. He was the leader of Ghana, and I think he was one of the most prominent African scholars and leaders. He was in the same group as the Julius Nyerere that followed him later on, and the president of Kenya, Uhuru. He said, and I quote, "We must, in the development of our university, bear in mind that once it has been planted in the African soil, it must take root amidst African traditions and culture." Nkrumah's insight was that for an African university to be truly useful to Africans, and I want to add to the world, it has to be grounded in African communities and cultures. This did not mean that the African university is an insular or a parochial entity. On the contrary, the African university is an institution that has the consciousness of an African identity, from which it derives and celebrates its strength and uses those strengths to its own competitive and comparative advantage in the international stage. We live in a global world. We live in a competitive world. Everybody tries to beat another person or to outsmart them. Globalized culture exists because different cultures compete in the world. You have Confucian culture or civilization from the Chinese and the Indians. You have Western culture from Western Europe. You have American culture from the America. You have South American culture from the people in South America. Then you've got this continent called Africa that has got no culture. So the world wants us to believe that we're just like chickens that are hatched and anybody can train them to become what they want them to be. We don't have anything that is our own. And sometimes we are the one who convince the people who tell us we don't have culture that actually, yes, we don't have it. So we make ourselves slaves in a period when we're not supposed to be slaves. So Kwame Nkrumah, who was the champion of Pan-Africanism, was trying to raise the consciousness of the leadership in Africa that in the highest educational institutions of our continent must begin to embrace the fact that they've got an identity that is African, that is located in African communities, that is supported by African communities, that must connect to those communities. And there's a reason for that, because as I say, knowledge and research or ideas don't come from the sky. You know, if you live here in KZN, you know something called madumbe. I don't know it when I'm in Limpopo. You eat madumbe. I don't eat them. But somebody has tested them that this is a food that is edible. So if I buy it at Woolworth, I don't have to go and try and be suspicious that I may be poisoned. I know that many Zulu people have eaten it and it's edible, and you will not be sick, or you will not be you will not die from it. So as I say, knowledge doesn't just fall from the sky. So that's basically what I mean when I say knowledge has got it belongs to someone, and universities have an identity. And the fourth point I want to make is this: universities have a vision, or most smart institutions have a vision. When we were creating the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we were saying we want to transform it into an African institution, we asked ourselves as a community, what should be the vision of this university be? And lo and behold, the university community decided that the university's vision should be to be the premier university of African scholarship. The very scholarship that I've just told you has now been accepted by UNESCO to be part of the global knowledge system. This very statement of a vision became a statement of identity, because it wasn't like the usual cliche of visions of university that you found either in South Africa or anywhere. Now, what did we mean by this? And I just want to quote from the person who actually had to write about this, because people always want to be, people love definitions, although sometimes I don't like them, and I'll tell you why. To be an African, this is a quote from him. He said, "To be African is not to separate from outside, but to play an integral and constructive part, without which the world, especially the world of scholarship and knowledge, remains incomplete and impoverished. Scholarship encapsulates a process of engagement with knowledge, its product, its application, and its dissemination. And being African distinguish that process of engagement. Basically, that's what we meant by African scholarship. It's a process of engagement that brings a new paradigm into the global knowledge system. That's how we came to this a vision of the Premier University of Scholarship. So those are the characteristics of a university that is in Africa. Now, earlier on, Sipo told you that I did live somewhere in a place called Oxford. In 1980, I was a student at Oxford, which is correct. I had a Nigerian colleague who was as arrogant as most Nigerians are. And we were just chatting, not in a negative person. He was just a very confident person who spoke his mind. And he said, and I want to quote his statement, he said, if a Nigerian had written William Wordsworth's famous poem, The Daffodil, in Nigeria, this Nigerian would have been found guilty by a military tribunal. He would have been sentenced to death or life imprisonment, or more kindly, he would have been certified mentally ill and sent to a mental asylum for long-term treatment and rehabilitation. I asked him why. Why this severe sentence? He said, he continued, daffodils don't grow in Nigeria. And this flower has no meaning to a Nigerian, culturally or existentially, in the life of Nigerians. Close quotation. So that's a mouthful, but it has got very rich interpretations. And as we sat there talking, he said to me, and I agreed with him, he said, did you realize that if there were no apples or apple trees where Sir Isaac Newton lived, where and when would the laws of gravity have been discovered? There had to be something that triggered his mind, and it was the fall of an apple that has now changed the laws of gravity as we know them today. He said, if all we had were showers, you know the famous shower in this part of the province, this is in Ganta place or something, you have showers because you are very hygienic, and there were no baths, Archimedes would not have figured out the relationship between volume and weight and assisted the king. He would not have experienced Eureka if there were only showers. There would have been no Eureka. And the king would not have solved the problems of weight and what the king was interested in. So the laws of shipping, as we see shipping in the Strait of Hormuz or wherever it is stuck there, they would not have been there if there were only showers and there were no baths. And Archimedes, who discovered that Eureka statement. If there were no vineyards in France, the Lille industrialists, the Emperor Napoleon, and the French agricultural industrialists would not have consulted Louis Pasteur. All of you know about Louis Pasteur. Bacteriology and hence the pathology of disease and the wine industry would not have existed as we know it. How many of you would have survived going through weekends of dryness without alcohol? You wouldn't have it if these things did not exist. When one wears a Levi jeans, one feels the spirit of being an American cowboy. And you know why? Because Levi is just the reverse spelling of Elvis. And most of you who grew up, you knew who Elvis was. That man who jiggled around and was one of the most popular icon of music at the time. When one drives a Mercedes Benz, which I suspect most of you drive, or a Jaguar, one identifies with the best of German or British engineering. You'd never think of a Jaguar as a South African engineered car or a Mercedes Benz. You think you are actually like a German person when you are in it. It feels that way. When one drinks whiskey, vodka, champagne, or one identifies with the Scots, you identify with the Russians because you know they love their vodkas, and you identify with the French because they love their champagnes. That's why they banned the word champagne in South Africa. So there is something about the relationship between knowledge, culture, and what we see as things that evolve. So this brings me to, I think I've tried to make you understand how knowledge evolves and how it gets identified. Now, this brings me to my second point, the concept of an African university, because that's what you want me to talk about. One of the burning issues for African scholars since independence has been the question of an African university. And as I said, I make a distinction between the many thousands of universities that are located in Africa and what African scholars were looking for when they defined this. The earliest I can go back to is through the independence of Ghana in 1956. But the first time this debate started was around 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah obviously made this important call about what African's universities should look like. But most of the scholars that have written about this, they recognize that education is the first step in the ladder of individual sovereignty. That is, for one to be masters of their own destiny. And they made a statement that education should be for all, by all, and for life. Through education, every individual learned to be. That is to have an identity. You learn to have an identity, to know, to do, and to live and to influence others. But education, importantly, allowed nations of the world to compete, to interact, to interconnect, and to globalize knowledge and culture. It was through education that happened. Higher education, in particular, being the pinnacle of the education system, was critical for all of these things that I've mentioned. Through higher education, as I said, the nations of the world were able to achieve the impossible through seeing the invisible. And what was that invisible? That invisible was education. It's an invisible force. The power and the strength of education lay in its invisibility and its silence. Like whispering death, its power lay in its silence and in its invisibility. It drives revolutionaries. It drives social and societal changes. It filters information for every society. It brings meanings and interpretations of the world around invisibility. You know, when I was in the UK, it was amazing. There were contraceptives everywhere in Europe. All European nations knew that you could take contraceptives. Some countries went liberal and allowed their teenagers to take contraceptives, like in the UK. In Italy, they did the opposite. The Roman Catholic Church, which is dominant there, became the religious guidance and filter of that knowledge that you can have contraceptives, but kids shouldn't take them. Today, we're having the same thing about the social media for children. As you know, Australia has already taken the view that young children should not, under the age of 16, should not be allowed to participate in social media. Of course, you won't do that in South Africa because you're scared you'll have a revolution. You won't tell kids not to do that, although it will take time and we'll have to debate. But what I'm trying to emphasize again is that knowledge is everywhere, but intellectuals and society leaders filter and choose what knowledge influences every society. Again, it's a question, a matter of choice, because the information is everywhere. But as a country, you want to bring kids or the next generation in a particular way. And in order to do that, the university system is part of that general filter system that allow society to do things in a particular way. And as I've said before, the likes of Z.K. Matthews, the likes of Julius Nyerere, the like of Yesefu, all of them were of the view that the importance of knowledge is rooted in the culture and the civilization of wherever that knowledge is taking place, whether it was a university or high school and so forth. So that's what uh, really an African universities should really look like. Uh, I think many other people, even some colonialists, accepted that, there is something about knowledge that is contextual. I think Lord Ashby in the UK, Jan Smuts in South Africa, one Harvard University principal, all of them understood that there's nothing miraculous about university education. It has got to be contextual. It has got to connect with the society that supports and funds it as such. Of course, in South Africa, when I came in 1995 and said, I think we should create a different kind of society, of course, I got into troubles, but that's the nature of life and battles anyway. Now, part of the reason why I had this idea was that, I trained in medicine here at King Edward Hospital. And all the books that I read in medicine were not written in South Africa. They were written in England. So when I arrived in England to practice medicine there, it was like home. It was like fish in water. As simple as that. But every time, the diseases that were common here, because we didn't write about them, we knew very little about our common disease, but knew too much about diseases that we didn't see. We didn't see heart attacks in my era at medical school, but we knew everything about heart attacks. And we knew about common diseases here in the country. So again, is we were being educated. Now you ask yourself, why would British people educate South African children about things that are in England? Because they were the colonial masters. And some of their children were studying here. And when they go back home, they must be able to integrate into their community. So if you started teaching them here about malnutrition and pellagra, and nobody has ever seen pellagra in England, do you think they would allow them to practice medicine in England? No, they wouldn't. Even, even people coming just across the channel from Spain or Portugal, they could never practice medicine in the UK because the systems were such that they were all grounded in the identity and the civilizations of those societies. And when it became even harder, they said, you don't speak our language. So how are you going to talk to our patients when you speak Portuguese and these people speak English? So again, language became an identifier of the barrier between this educational system. So again, what it says is that education is grounded in people because education is a human construct. There's nothing, as I say, miraculous about it. But finally, when you said you wanted to Africanize education and higher education, the word African assumed a different meaning. It was not about humanity, it was about race. So they converted a very simple word into the whole issue of a race. But I want to end this part of the argument by saying, as far as I know, as I've said, that all knowledge has got signature. So all that we know in the globe that is quite popular, it has started somewhere local and became global. Nothing starts globally and becomes local. It's twisted the other way around. Knowledge starts locally and then it expands globally once it becomes something that people enjoy. Now, I want to finally talk about the so-called prospects. And this is maybe the most difficult part of my talk. Since 1994 in South Africa, the prospects and opportunities for creating authentic African universities have existed in South Africa. But as I've discussed with you, you would realize that these opportunities have existed in the African continent since 1957 when Ghana became independent. Of course, in South Africa, as we all know, we love committees, we love commissions, and we love working groups, discussion groups, and so forth. So we have had many of these since 1994, and all of them have created really a rich, fertile work of an environmental framework in which the creation of such African institutions could be established. And the creation of UKZN came through this policy framework of the mergers. And it has tried to understand what it means to be an African university. And I think it's way down the road in that journey. Despite Africa being independent for over 70 years, there are few authentic African universities in the continent. However, Africa is replete with many universities that remain and are proud to be outposts of their colonial masters. French-speaking countries, they look up to France. English-speaking countries, they look up to the UK. Portuguese-speaking universities, they look up to Portugal. They are not themselves, they don't look into their local communities, whether people speak Fola there or whatever, as to how can we actually teach our children. Are you not surprised here in South Africa that despite 30 years of our democracy, we are still not having a university that teaches in one of the indigenous knowledges, except Afrikaans? And how did the Afrikaners do it? Because not so long ago, they were colonized by the British. But they decided when they became free to set up universities that can teach at university level in Afrikaans. If you go to China, nobody speaks English in China. You learn in Mandarin. If you can't do that, you go to hell. You go to France, nobody teaches in English in France. It's French. You go to Mexico, it's Spanish, because the whole country speaks Spanish. All the education and its sort of transmission, generation, is done in Spanish. You go to Brazil, one of the BRICS countries, it's in Portuguese. So we shouldn't underestimate the fact that indigenous knowledges and indigenous languages are very important for the transmission and the creation of knowledge. You know, when I was at UKIT, and then I used to laugh that, we could be sitting in a meeting like this, and if somebody makes a joke in Zulu in say a Senate meeting, only Zulus would laugh. The others wouldn't laugh. And when you come out to have a bit of a break or something, you'll be asking, what was he saying? But they live here all the time. So now you must start translating to them what this guy was saying to make a joke. Even when you swear at them, sometimes they don't even understand. They just laugh. So there is something that we need to understand about the power of language. So I want to emphasize again, I think we are doing something to ourselves that I don't know how to describe it. There are many, as I say, universities that continue to inhibit the emergence of authentic African universities. As a people, we seem not proud of our identity and our languages. One often hears how expensive it would be to develop our languages to cope with modern technological advancement. How does English cope with that? Because every year, the English language board sits down and picks up new words that infuse the English language. It happens in China, it happens everywhere. We are the only ones who keep our language at bay. We don't want to develop them. And then we blame someone that we can't teach when we don't develop them. And you ask yourself, what's wrong with us? Sometimes you have to accept that maybe this is a measure of how successful colonialism has been in our country. If ever there is a group of people, we normally complain about Nigerians in this country. Sometimes for good reason and sometimes not for good reason. But Nigerians are very proud people. They are happy to mess their own country. They are equally happy to develop it. They are not afraid. It's their country. They don't have to cow down to anybody. It's their country. They are very proud of it. They will do what it is. Just think about it. We all have interacted here with Nigerians in one form or another. I have never heard that there's a population of white people in Nigeria. I don't think they exist. They've all run away. They were not chased by anybody. I'm sure they were just They just realize that this is not their place. I'm not saying that we should adopt that kind of attitude, but I'm just giving you an example of what happens when a people wants to identify who they are in society, and they do and they behave in particular ways. I think one must concede, as Africans, we have been psychologically, I think, colonized, as Steve Biko said. We are just shells of who we should be. As the late Winnie Madikizela Mandela once said of the ANC in government, he said, "We are a government, we are in government, but we have no power." She said this somewhere in 2010, I think, in the Evening Standard, in an interview with Nadira Naipo. She was, however, at the time referring to the economic power that we didn't have and we still don't have now. Now, Professor Kunene, I'm going to come to you. I've been a Vice-Chancellor for a very short period of time. I know the power that Vice-Chancellors have. I have to say, I know that my colleague Vice-Chancellors don't exercise the power and the authority that they have. I've seen this happen many, many times, but I think you have taken a different view in the delivery of what you told us today. So most vice chancellors and principals of our universities are in charge, but without power. And that's of their own making. It is not in the statutes of the university. One of the autonomies of the universities is that you teach what you want, you teach who you want. And so, those are the corners of the academic freedom. But we don't exercise that principle to change the curriculum and to change the identity of the university in the manner we need to do. We are waiting for someone like Paul Simon to come and tell us, you are now an African university, and sing a song, and then we will become an African. That's what happened to Lady Smith, Black Mambazo. They were nobody cared about them until Paul Simon came. So how many Paul Simons are we going to get to change who we are? So, colleagues, I think it is no longer for me acceptable to simply blame the past when the country is in our hands. We must ask in what ways we are oppressing ourselves and the future generation of South Africans in development. Despite the fact that we have now got the so-called freedom that we found, we must set our own agenda in the manner that is befitting of the country that we imagine that we want to have. In my mother tongue, which is Sepedi, there is a proverb that I would want to quote, and then I'll translate it for the people of this province. In Sepedi, there's this proverb that says, "Poya mshimani yaibia." If you want to translate it, it says, "A young bull installs itself in the kraal. It doesn't ask and stamps its authority." We lack courage, the confidence, and the killer instinct in order to define our academy and its identity. And on that note, I will stop and thank you. Let me remind you, a former leader of this province used to give speeches longer than I have done. He's no more, but I think he's a trademark you all know. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Makgoba for distilling what it means to create an African university and make it much more simpler and consumable. Because there are times when we hide behind the jargon, but it is always important to be able to have an example of what is possible. That is moving from advocacy to implementation. And what you did in a short space of time within 10 years at the UKZN is commendable. By the way, for all of you who could not access that one slide, and I should also say, Vetri, this is a signature of Professor Makgoba. When he makes presentation, it is one slide or two slides, and he tries to, like a scientist, to make sure that a graph or one slide captures everything, and he speaks around that. I'm not saying you guys must emulate him, but if you can, that's always a good idea. And Professor Kunene, I want to provoke you a little bit, and the provocation is your presentation and that of Professor Makgoba should not wait until the end of the year. I think working with the CMD, we should actually think of putting this together as an occasional publication because I can't imagine a far greater contribution that this university can make in terms of stating what it is all about. I want to thank you for laying the foundation in the most sharpest way. Also, I did like most importantly the issue of the grammar of change. That what you also need to do is to be able to capture or acquire these languages for engagement. What Professor Makgoba is able to do is to say, how does the grammar of change express itself? But that is not my job to reflect on what Professor Makgoba said. We have one of the most capable scholars in this university that has been invited to share his views. And I've already intimidated him when it comes to time because I know when he gets passionate about the subject, he never stops. Dr. Rana.
This is my clock, so I can be accountable, um, and I'll put it on. Good morning to all of you colleagues and esteemed guests and the Vice-Chancellor, and especially our speaker, Professor Makgoba. As a young man who used to like reading the newspapers, because of the debating society when I was in high school, I did follow in my early university years, as well as a high school student, some of the debates you were involved in the press. So I was amused to see you closing off your discussion by reference to the Pedi proverb having to do with the bull, because one of the greatest controversies you're associated with, at least for us students, was your daring to compare white males who had lost power to the bonobo monkeys. And this was to cause a furore that lasted for several years, if I remember. So it seems that the proverbs from the animal kingdom back. So, because of the limitations which have been placed on my freedom to exercise liberty with the clock, I'll confine myself to a very rough series of notes that deal with various aspects and provocations which arose during the discussion. The first is a drawing that the professor made from the insight of Z.K. Matthews about the importance of history and historicity in the foundation of an African university. Now, many people would be astounded, even from a commonsensical level, to think about the idea that it was thought, even during the previous century, it was argued, for instance, by the eminent Oxford historian Hugh Trevor Roper, that Africa did not have a history and that it might have one in the future. It may seem strange to you, but this depends on the technicity with which you think of history itself. Now, history bears two senses. The first sense of history is simply a reference, very generally and commonsensically, to things which have happened in the past. But the more technical definition, it describes a particular scientific subject, the study of which is the purposive and self-conscious movement of human beings and their consciousness over time. If this sounds too abstract, I'll draw an example from the animal kingdom, which African people have been compared to throughout the history of colonial conquest. Now, animals sometimes are described as falling into the category of natural history, but the point is that animals are thought to fall outside of history, right? And the reason for this is that although horses have existed, for instance, for millennia in their current form, they are thought to not possess the capacity to participate in history because they lack self consciousness. So each generation of horses eats grass, neighs, gives birth, and dies without ever inquiring about the nature of the existence of horses and leaving the accumulated knowledge of what it is like to be a horse to other horses. They inherit what their horseliness through instincts and the genes they receive from their parents rather than through the conduct of inquiries about the nature of being a horse. Okay. Now, human beings are distinguished supposedly from other animals by their possession of this facility and capacity to inquire into the nature of their own existence and experience. Now, all science is historical, to draw on Huntonji, the Beninois philosopher, to the extent that disciplines themselves exhibit their humanity by their historical nature. So the colonialists suggested that Africans are not historical animals. They are very much like those creatures of nature who lack this self consciousness. And it was predicated on this assumption that it was thought that there can be universities in Africa, but there can be no African university because there is no African history, no African science to speak of. If you like, in a more general way, you can supposedly observe historical activity even by looking, for instance, at the architecture of a people, of their medicine. The discovery of what things poison and what things heal is received by subsequent generations of physicians in such a way that you can see the historical development of a particular discipline. So, in this way, the business of the university is precisely historical. Are we together? Okay. So, the second thing which our speaker made reference to, it was a phrase that he used in the second part describing the university, where he said, when we acquired our so called freedom. I was very relieved to hear that we at least share the perspective that the freedom which was received is only so called. And it's an essential component of precisely the struggle for the establishment of a liberated African University that this so-called is in pronounced bold before the freedom. Now, theoreticians of freedom generally distinguish between two modes. They speak about positive and negative liberty. Negative liberty or freedom describes freedom from when one is in bondage, when one is chained, when one is conquered and dominated. The first stage of freedom is freedom from the bondage itself to overcome the captor. The second stage of freedom we describe as positive freedom, which is the freedom to. Now, Nkrumah, who was referred to also by the speaker, had a successful tenure in 1957 and inspired many people, especially after the All Africa People's Conference. But already by the time of the conference, the CIA was full and packed throughout the halls, studying all the individuals and esteemed elders who were there to take directive about the future freedom of the continent. Nkrumah was given a chance to fail by the Western world until he arrived, and this is because at the time he still held on to the basic idea that political and economic liberation could be separated and phrased. You know, his famous biblically drawn phrase is "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall be added unto thee," from the book of Matthew. But by 1965, he published an important book called Neo-Colonialism, the highest stage of imperialism. The book opens by making the point about this nature of the so-called freedom. What another esteemed African scholar, Ali Mazrui, would call, in describing independence, as a transition from slavery uh, by coercion to slavery by consent. And the basic observation was exactly that their master, the colonial master, had kept the jewels and given the African the crown. Okay, so it was a crown without jewels, and they literally made away with the jewels, as you know. Even in the jewelry of the British royal family contains this Cullinan diamond from around these parts, so they literally took the jewels. But the point is that there is no freedom without the ability to fill your own stomach. As Sankara pointed out, he who feeds you dominates you. Now, I'm almost exhausted my time, but the point about this for the African University is the problem at the intellectual level that we describe as extraversion. This is Huntonji again, that at the time of even expressing what is supposed to be African discourse, we are forced or desire to turn to the journals of our erstwhile colonial conquerors to communicate with each other. This is a senseless sort of activity. In order to carry out activities which are directed to the liberation of our continent and our students, we have to turn to grant makers and funders amongst the very enemies of our people. So long as we continue to bicker about the crown while asking for little crumbs of jewels which properly belong to the African continent, to the colonial conqueror, it will become an impossibility, except symbolically, to have an African university that tends to the basic living problems. Once we have the freedom from, I believe that what will germinate is an organic culture, which was beginning to happen before the structural adjustment programs of the International Monetary Fund in many African countries at independence, in the Ibadan school, in the Dar es Salaam history tradition, in the African philosophy which grew out of Zaire. But immediately the problem began, the jewels were taken away from the crown. In any case, esteemed colleagues, I am just here to respond and provoke. Thank you very much.
Professor Makgoba, Professor Rada has these tendencies of putting an abstract as a way of saying you should invite me to elaborate on what I was saying. So I know Professor Brown has taken note of that. And effectively, one of the speakers of the VC's public lectures will be Professor Rada. And we're going to hold him to expand on this provocation. But I want to thank you very much for really putting it so succinctly that this is really about two elements: freedom from, but also freedom to do, as my former boss will ask, it will be freedom to do what? So the question that he was also pointing out to Professor Kunene is that it's very important that when you are given responsibility, you can't continue to claim that you have no power. This is what Professor Makgoba was able to do and to show at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Now, my task is to call on Professor Brown. Actually, even before that, maybe I should invite people who have questions or comments on the three speakers that have spoken. And I think let me open it up to you, ladies and gentlemen. Don't be intimidated. Oh, where's it? Okay, student at the back there. You. Yeah, just press it. It should be. They should help you too. Okay, the next one. Try. Okay, I think you can come down if it's not working. Yeah, come here. In the other hand, please, colleagues, don't tell me that you've been paralyzed. Professor Pume, even just a mere comment. Come in.
Greetings to the House, and thank you, Director. My name is Saz Ndlela, the current SRC President of this institution. I think the reason why there's no much hands for submissions or comments is because the speakers spoke very well and they covered almost everything. And also thank you to our main speaker, Professor Makgoba. And I can assure you, Prof, that on the side of the student board, the ground is indeed fertile. You can even see during our graduation ceremonies, our students wear their traditional attires proudly and showing their Africanicity. But however, I still believe that there's still a role, Professor Sepe, that we need to play in guiding this proudness of being African, so that it cannot be limited to being proud of certain ethnic groups of Africa. Because in that sense, you even find our students and also our staff members being part of this ongoing protest against African people and so forth. Because this thing of African proudness has been limited to being African of being proud of certain ethnic groups of Africa. But I also want to make a submission to the whole House and the management to say, uh, for us to become an African university, there's something we should not run away from, of which is to firstly analyze the capacity of our institution in delivering what we want, or in achieving that ideological goal of which is an African university, of which it must speak to the operations of the university, our employment criteria as the university, to say, are the people we employ to the university ready enough or capacitated enough for this idea that we want, of which is an African university. For example, even from security guards, cleaners, staff members, HODs, even the management itself. And there's also something, Professor Makgoba, you mentioned that even our Vice-Chancellor has a bigger role to play in delivering us to this ideological end of which is an African university. To say even the curriculum. In fact, I've said many times on these kinds of platforms, and it's what we mostly allude on, to say the curriculum of the institution must speak to what we want as an institution. For example, when Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Kwame Nkrumah identified that there is a need for an African socialism, it's because the socialism of that they knew did not speak to the current issues of Africa, to the current issues of Africa as a continent. So for us as an institution to become an African university, we must check that is what we want relevant in our institution, is what we want is our institution have that capacity to deliver us into what we want. And in that sense, it comes back to what I've been speaking about, the operations, the employment criteria, and so forth. I would like to thank you.
I see the dean has been provoked. Press. Okay. Yeah.
Different kinds of communities where we do even translations of what does it mean. For example, University of Zululand. When we translate it, we say in University at Zulu. And when you give the project, some
Mm-hmm. Any other question? I thought that.
Programs that you're talking about. Yeah, actually the reason why I went and did my PhD. But I think what we need to learn from you, having led an institution through such dramatic change, I think the question for me is, how do we move in the midst of resistance? How do we create a critical mass that will run and influence the rest of us in the direction that the university wants to go? I think that is what I would like, if you can share with us, how do we create that group of people who buy into the idea and have the energy to push forward. And as they move forward, they draw the rest of the people with them in the direction that the university is trying to take. Thank you.
Yeah, very clear. Professor Akume, are you? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. Makgoba. I have been following you for some time, and I find your record very protocols, greetings to the Vice-Chancellor and all the colleagues. My interest is not in your reference to Nigeria, by the way. But that you gave a young bull in Prof, which I think is a very, very insightful saying. I always feel uncomfortable when we talk about Black people in general, and we are often accused of blaming. I find that term a bit uncomfortable. And your reference again to what Winnie Mandela said regarding the group of people in office, but not in power, which Professor Gada also referred to. That young bull has power. It does have power. Its ability to install itself in the crowd doesn't just come from a consciousness. Young bulls, I think, are even stronger than older bulls. So I think here again, we have the dialectic between agency and structure. I think it's unfair to Black people to just say they blame. It's like saying to the people in Gaza, if the people in Gaza rise up today and say that the cause of their suffering is the Israeli system, is the US system, are we also going to say they are blaming somebody else with their problems? If George Floyd were to rise up from the grave and we tell him, why didn't he rise up? Are we going to blame him that his neck was under the knees of those, was surrounded by very many white cops? So I think I'll end by pointing again to what Prof. Tobela has asked. Your position will gives you, I think, an advantage to let us know how, maybe from the point of view of a university such as ours, but also the larger decolonization project, how do we get power such that we can exercise it and install ourselves in the crowd? Because I don't think we are suffering because we want to blame. When I say we now, Black people in general, because we are content blaming people. I think there's a real issue of a lack of power. You may have experienced it, or a limit to power, and sometimes this power is an illusion of power that actually doesn't exist. But I don't imagine that George Floyd will allow himself to be killed if he had the power in himself, just like the people in Gaza. The Jews themselves were slaughtered in Europe. If they had that power, I doubt that they would have allowed themselves to be killed, and then later they come and blame their killers. So maybe what we need is greater insight into how we can generate power, as Prof. Tobela says, maybe a mass of power that individual collective agency can be used to overcome structural suffocation. I thank you.
I think the comments and the provocations are clear. Professor Makgoba,
Check if your mic, if that's it works. Okay, then maybe may I allow you to, unless if there is another pressing question.
The situation in South Africa, there are certain things that you can display with the aim of organizing. There are things you can take on a map. There are things that we should now get together. You must take charge of what you are responsible for. were not strong enough in that direction. We quickly, when something doesn't work our way, we quickly look at the past. How can we move into the future? Rather than say, let's look into the past, which is often hindsight. One of the things that I've also learned, I think, in my scientific career is that sometimes there are things happening around you, but you don't have the consciousness to recognize that things are happening. So there are observations that you could be, and you don't observe it. You are so engaged in other things, or you are so paralyzed that you don't see even the obvious. Maybe the simple example, how to get someone to become an inspiring leader in a nation. Say, for example, Nelson Mandela. What is it that he saw that was so obvious that other people didn't see that he struggled? So it's the power of observation and the clarity of your thinking. And I think it links to what the two colleagues of yours have said. That you are in a university that have got a unique role to play in the country. And you can sit down and ask yourself, what is your mission? Because your mission has to be specific, your mission has to be distinct, your mission has to also identify you as to who you are in the zoo. Because the zoo can be a very dangerous place. I mean, you can sink or you can survive. So I think it's really a question of reading the environment, asking yourself other questions, and having clarity of thought as to what you stand for and what you want to achieve. There's no magic about that. Now, the reason why I was saying that my colleague Vice-Chancellor, don't seem to appreciate the powers they have. It's not because I'm trying to undermine. I know that in institutionalized hierarchy, we listen to the bosses. South African people, they still live in that mentality because of where we come from historically. So when you have an opportunity to move the needle in that kind of power, you try to use it. There are many of us who did not experience what we're experiencing following independence. Now, some of us, when that happens, we go into our houses and read our bread and say, I've arrived. Okay? How often have you heard that in South Africa somebody say, oh, I'm the first this, I'm the only this? It seems to become something that we're very proud of. Instead of, I mean, when they said we have the largest antiretroviral program in the world, I was quite ashamed. How can we allow? Yeah. But some people use that as a sense of pride. This is what for this period. When it's a huge burden of disease, and we're proud of it because the WHO has now given us that kind of thing. So there are these subtleties, and also I think the reason why I took a little bit of the time to explain what I was trying to explain by using examples was because I don't have often time to come to this part of the world to speak and to meet some people. And what I was saying, it's not literal. There is a lot of nuance in what I was trying to say. But I was trying to give examples so that people have a broader way in which they can pick from what I've said and develop things and reach the debate forward. But really, I don't think I've got a unique way of saying how was I distinguish what it said in Zulu, the University of Zulu and the University of Zulu. I don't have the
that capacity to do that. But certainly, I think you should define that. I know that when I was in the National Working Group, there was a strong view that the University of Zululand should belong to the University of KwaZulu-Natal, but that's not how the name came about. It was before the name, but they felt that this should be one university, and it was the argument went forward and against and so on. So yeah, that's what the plan.
Yeah, colleagues, we will not exhaust this discussion. Will be evolving. And Professor Makgoba, thank you for that enunciation of your experience and also the pointers that you've actually given to us in terms of how do we give a concrete expression to the presentation by the Vice-Chancellor. Now I see that there are no comments coming from people who are online, but the issue is that is not to exhaust everything. And some of the questions that have been asked, as Professor Makgoba indicate, that they are simply there to be problem posing. We are not going to be able to solve everything, but we should also ask ourselves whether we taking advantage of the opportunities that are given to us, whether the freedoms that we have, whether they come with the type of responsibility that is expected. In the fact that we occupy very important space in the body politics of this country, and we should not fail. We should not be daunted by the immensity of the task. One of the things that the James Baldwin said when he talked to African Americans, and they wondered what type of drugs has he been into. He responded by saying, "I know what I'm asking is impossible, but in our country, the impossible is the least we can demand." And Professor Brown, that is the task that befalls us. And I would like to invite you so that we remain in terms of our time schedule. Professor Flatter was talking about being prisoners of this technology, but for now, I'll allow myself to be imprisoned by the technology for convenience. Professor Brown, it's your chance to say the vote of thanks, and feel free to problematize and provoke us to what will be the next engagement.
Thank you very much, Professor Sepe. I see you have given me an additional assignment as well. By way of protocol, nevertheless, let me acknowledge our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Kunene, our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Makgoba, members of the University Council Online. I was checking whether Prof. Mabunda and Dr. Kaniki are there, but I acknowledge you nevertheless. Other colleagues online, colleagues here present in the council chambers, ladies and gentlemen, we have now touched the afternoon. Say good afternoon. Hello. Thank you, thank you. It is never an easy, never a pleasant feeling, Professor Makgoba, to bring a rich discussion of this nature to a close. But unfortunately, this is what Professor Sepe has asked me to do at this time. As we reflect on the task at hand to build an authentic African university. We are reminded by all our speakers, starting from the Vice-Chancellor in her opening commentary, to Professor Siepe in his introductory, and of course, closing off contributions, to you, Professor Makgoba, as the keynote, and of course, Professor Gladler in his response. We are reminded that the formation of an authentic African university is both an urgent necessity and a profound responsibility. The idea of establishing an African university that is authentic and fully grounded in the African conditions, as have been captured by yourself earlier, Professor Makgoba, is not new. I think we've all recognized this. You've called attention to many of the giants: Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, Ali Mazuri. I want to throw in there Chick Anta Diop, who was also part of the early giants calling for this African university. Way back, as you have said, the 1950s, when we started this transition towards self-rule, at least politically. Ironically, the reasons for the urgency to establish the authentic African university then closely mirror those discussed in the webinar today. We still want to assert epistemic independence. We're still striving to reclaim African identity within knowledge production systems. And we are still striving to address locally relevant challenges. And all of those were some of the early reasons identified by our giants. And we see them still coming out in our discussion today. The giants on whose shoulder we are standing today, said the very same things. You know, if we have been questioning and doubting since as far back as the 1950s whether our existing Eurocentric universities can truly serve the continent's needs or respond to local realities, then the question is, why have we been unable to change? Why have we been unable to change? Why are we still going in circles, so to speak? Why are we yet to have an authentic African university in our midst? What is wrong with us, you have asked? What is wrong with us? And I think, Prof. Koba, you answered us in part. And I want to just maybe say it in a different way. So I'll tell you why. What is wrong with us? I think we are cowards. I'm just putting it in another way, but I know you are hedging along that line. We are afraid to dismantle inherited models and to reimagine universities as spaces that are deeply rooted in African knowledge systems, responsive to societal needs, reflect African histories, cultures, and identities, as you have mentioned, and to support nation building, and to be confident enough as an institution to showcase that African identity. We are afraid to repurpose and to rewrite the curriculum. We're afraid to write books to be used as learning resources in the curriculum. We are afraid to innovate and to develop new teaching models. and methodologies. We're afraid. And that is why I like the view that Professor Kunene highlighted, that the African University, whilst it is not a destination, we should be able to see visibly what incremental changes have taken place. So thank you, Professor Kunene, for setting the scene so well, reminding us that an authentic African university does not imply rejecting global knowledge. Those three pillars that you mentioned, Afrocentricity, decolonization, and Africanization. That, and I think you've explained it very well in terms of each of those pillars. Recentering, all three come together, could be said as recentering Africa, African experience within the curriculum, within pedagogy, and the global knowledge systems. It is not about demographics. Instead, it's about rethinking what counts as knowledge. UniZulu has made some significant strides in this effort or this journey to become an African university. We have installed the idea within our strategy. We have developed policies that shape our practice. We have research taking place within this area. Some of the projects that you mentioned are still to be mainstream, but we must be able to see visibly physical things that have resulted from this journey. Thank you, Professor Makgoba, for a thought-provoking public lecture. Your survey of the prospects, challenges, and opportunities that underpin the establishment of an African university serve as a stark reminder of the journey ahead, despite what we have done so far as the University of Zululand. I like the idea of having strategic projects. You mentioned the IKS Institute, you mentioned the medical, um, I think it was a medical, let me just quickly look at my notes here. It was something medical. It was, yeah, the medical knowledge, you have medicinal knowledge is the African Health Center. Yeah, I know it was something medical, right? Thank you very much for the reminder. Yeah, thank you so much. And of course, the one on, there was also the one on poetry, and as a research chair. Yeah. You see, those are, I'm really focusing on those as a way of saying thank you, because I think they represent tangible projects that we can relate to. So thank you for triggering these reminders that we need to go forward. And then the other thing that I want to thank you about is calling attention to leadership, the essential component of leadership in driving this agenda, which is why you reference the power of the Vice-Chancellor. Thank you, Professor Ladler, for the incisive, though brief, response to the lecture. You share the sentiment that I share, that an authentic African university cannot be realized if the curriculum implementers are Eurocentric knowledge gatekeepers, because this constrained African intellectual self-determination. The academic team has to reflect on their positionality, and more than that, they have to engage reflexively as we go forward on this journey. Your point about freedom from and freedom to, is at the core of the issue at hand. And I think that's part of what we should, as academics, be reflecting on as we go out of this venue. Thank you for those insights. Thank you, Professor CFA, for so ably guiding the discussion and setting the room on fire with your welcome and introductory remarks, and for summing up, which highlights the contributions and takeaway. I think you mentioned putting together the paper from both the keynote speaker and the opening commentary of the Vice Chancellor as one way of taking this discussion forward. As you rightly indicate, the richness of the discussion offers key insights for our own planning as we get into the next strategic planning cycle as a university, and also for our research agenda going forward. Vice Chancellor, let me also thank the planning team who have drawn together this event, led by Ms. Lungelwa. Thank you very much for coordinating the event and pulling all of us together in this way. Thanks to CMD. I see Precious. You're back. Oh, thanks to CMD for the ongoing publicity of the Vice Chancellor's webinar event and showcasing it to the world. Thanks to our audience online and to our colleagues here physically. We hope the discussion triggered a renewed sense of purpose and agency to take this project forward. And the keen interest is there. We could hear it from the questions that have been posed and the thought-provoking discussion that will continue as a result of this. Ladies and gentlemen, since I have the power to say close as well, right? Let me take this opportunity to say we have come now to the end of today. Our next webinar will be in July. So until then, I wish you a pleasant day, and this session now has come to a close. Thank you very much.